In the early 1960s, America looked confident on the surface. Music poured out of radios, dance floors filled up, and optimism was part of the national identity. But beneath the cultural energy, the economic foundations of the country were under stress. Policymakers in Washington were confronting a problem that traditional economic thinking said should not exist. The economy was slowing, jobs were disappearing. And yet, lowering interest rates carried a danger far greater than recession. At that time, the United States was still bound to gold. Every dollar was ultimately anchored to a fixed quantity of metal. And that constraint turned monetary policy into a high-stakes balancing act. Lowering rates would normally encourage borrowing, investment, and growth. But, with global capital free to move, cheaper U.S. rates meant money would flee overseas in search of higher returns. Those dollars would come back demanding gold, draining the nation's reserves and threatening the credibility of the currency itself. Protect the economy and risk losing gold, or protect the gold and sacrifice growth. That was the trap. President Kennedy reportedly feared this dilemma almost as much as nuclear confrontation, because a collapsing balance of payments could unravel American power without a single shot fired. Out of this impossible situation emerged a strategy that was subtle, experimental, and deeply controversial. Instead of moving interest rates as a single block, policymakers decided to split them apart. Short-term rates would be held firm to discourage capital flight, while long-term rates would be pushed lower to revive investment, housing, and industrial borrowing. The idea was to reshape the structure of interest rates without expanding the money supply. It was not about printing more dollars. It was about rearranging time itself. This maneuver became known as Operation Twist. The central bank would sell short-dated government securities, increasing their supply and nudging their yields higher. At the same time, it would use the proceeds to buy long-dated bonds, driving up their prices and pulling long-term yields down. On paper, it was elegant. It aimed directly at the yield curve, flattening it in a controlled way while preserving confidence in the dollar. For a brief moment, it appeared to work. The gap between short and long rates narrowed, and policymakers congratulated themselves for outsmarting the constraints of the gold standard. But financial markets are not static machines. They adapt. Investors noticed that long-term bonds were becoming expensive and yields unattractive. Many responded by selling those bonds and moving into shorter maturities, counteracting the central bank's efforts. The private market, vast and decentralized, absorbed and diluted the intervention. The ultimate effect on long-term rates was modest, barely measurable, and the deeper problems remained unresolved. The gold standard would collapse a decade later anyway, and Operation Twist faded into history as an interesting footnote rather than a triumph. For decades, the strategy lay dormant. Monetary policy evolved toward simpler tools, especially manipulating overnight rates. But the financial crisis of 2008 shattered the old playbook. Interest rates were slashed to zero. Massive asset purchases followed, and still the recovery limped along. By the early 2010s, political resistance to further money creation was growing louder. Inflation fears dominated headlines, even though growth remained weak. The central bank needed stimulus without expansion. That meant revisiting an old idea. Half a century after its first appearance, Operation Twist returned in a very different world. There was no gold constraint this time. Instead, there was a broken housing market and an economy weighed down by debt. The objective was clear: force long-term borrowing costs, especially mortgage rates, to historic lows. For most households, the overnight policy rate is abstract. What matters is the 30-year mortgage, and that rate is anchored to long-term government bonds. The modern version of the operation was larger, more aggressive, and far less tentative. Hundreds of billions of dollars in short-term securities were sold, while long-dated bonds were purchased on a scale that reshaped the market. The central bank did not merely influence prices. It became one of the dominant players. Long-term yields fell sharply, and mortgage rates followed, unleashing a wave of refinancing and relief for indebted homeowners. But the real mechanism ran deeper than cheaper loans. By removing safe long-duration assets from the market, policymakers forced investors to adapt. Pension funds, insurers, and conservative institutions could no longer meet their return targets with government bonds. To survive, they moved outward into corporate debt, equities, and real estate. Risk was no longer optional, it was mandatory. This shift inflated asset prices across the board, lifting stock markets and rewarding those who already owned financial assets. This created a powerful but uneven recovery. Borrowers benefited, asset holders prospered, savers suffered. Traditional sources of safe income evaporated, and the reward for caution disappeared. Keeping money in the bank became a losing proposition. This silent transfer of wealth from savers to debtors was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which the system healed itself, at least temporarily. When the pandemic arrived, even this was not enough. Markets seized, liquidity vanished, and the bond market itself began to crack. At that point, twisting the curve was insufficient. The response escalated into outright dominance. The central bank stepped in as buyer of last resort, absorbing enormous quantities of government and mortgage debt. Long-term yields were pinned down even as borrowing exploded. The traditional relationship between debt issuance and interest rates broke apart completely. This marked a turning point. Markets were no longer discovering the price of money. That price was being imposed. The consequences rippled outward. Asset bubbles expanded, speculation intensified, and housing prices surged beyond the reach of new buyers. The suppression of yields encouraged leverage everywhere, from households to banks to governments. Eventually, inflation returned, and with it, the limits of manipulation. When rates began to rise, the assets that had been priced for a low-yield world fell sharply. Bonds, once considered the safest investment, suffered historic losses. Institutions that had trusted long-term stability found themselves exposed. The unwinding revealed how fragile the system had become after years of intervention. Today, the legacy of Operation Twist is everywhere. The yield curve remains distorted. Housing markets are frozen by past policy choices. Governments face rising interest costs on mountains of debt. And central banks are trapped between inflation and instability, unsure how to exit without triggering crisis. What began as a clever workaround has evolved into a permanent condition. The manipulation of interest rates was once an emergency measure. Now it is a structural feature of the system. The price of time, the most important signal in a market economy, no longer reflects natural forces. It reflects necessity, debt, and political survival. The dance that started as a short-term maneuver has become the only routine left. As the years progressed, the consequences of long-term rate manipulation began to reveal themselves in subtle but dangerous ways. Markets that rely on honest price signals started to malfunction. When interest rates are artificially suppressed, they stop acting as warnings. Risk no longer looks risky. Debt feels cheap, manageable, even harmless. Businesses borrow, not because projects are productive, but because money is available. Governments spend not because growth will repay the cost, but because refinancing seems effortless. The discipline that normally restrains excess quietly disappears. One of the most profound distortions emerged in government finance itself. For decades, rising debt would normally push interest rates higher, forcing politicians to confront trade-offs, spend more, pay more. But once long-term yields were deliberately restrained, that feedback loop broke. The cost of borrowing stopped reflecting reality. Deficits ballooned without immediate consequence, reinforcing the belief that debt no longer mattered. This was not fiscal responsibility evolving. It was fiscal gravity being suspended. The bond market, once feared as a ruthless enforcer of discipline, lost its teeth. In earlier eras, investors who doubted government credibility would dump bonds, pushing yields higher and forcing policy changes. These so-called bond vigilantes acted as an external check on political excess. But when the central bank stands ready to absorb unlimited supply, selling pressure loses its power. You cannot intimidate a buyer who prints currency. Vigilance gives way to submission. This shift created a fragile equilibrium. Stability depended not on fundamentals, but on confidence in continued intervention. As long as markets believed long-term rates would remain controlled, the system held together. But that belief carried an implicit promise. If inflation ever returned in a meaningful way, the entire structure would be tested. Low rates and high inflation cannot coexist indefinitely without consequences. When inflation finally surged, it exposed the cost of years spent manipulating the yield curve. Policymakers were forced back into a dilemma, eerily similar to the one faced decades earlier. To restore price stability, rates needed to rise. But higher rates threatened everything built on cheap money: housing, equities, banking balance sheets, and government finances. The tools that once solved crises had created a new one. As rates climbed, long-duration assets suffered brutal losses. Bonds that were purchased under the assumption of permanent low yields collapsed in value. This shocked investors who had been taught to view government debt as risk-free. The danger had always been there, hidden beneath suppressed volatility. When control loosened, that risk surfaced all at once. Banks, which had loaded up on long-term securities to earn marginal yield in a low-rate world, suddenly faced large unrealized losses. What appeared safe on paper became lethal in practice. Liquidity crises emerged not from exotic speculation, but from the very assets designed to ensure stability. The irony was stark. Intervention meant to prevent collapse ended up concentrating risk where it could do the most damage. Housing, too, bore the scars. Years of artificially low mortgage rates pulled future demand into the present. Buyers rushed in, prices soared, and affordability vanished. When rates normalized, activity froze. Millions of homeowners were locked into ultra-low mortgages they could never afford to give up. The market lost its mobility. Labor flexibility declined. Economic efficiency suffered. A policy designed to stimulate growth ended up trapping it. The deeper issue was not one crisis or one market. It was dependency. Once rates are manipulated for long enough, the economy adapts around them. Debt structures, asset valuations, and government budgets all become calibrated to an artificial environment. Removing that support is no longer a policy choice. It becomes a systemic threat. The central bank is no longer guiding markets. It is holding them up. This is why discussions increasingly turn toward permanent yield control. Rather than temporary programs, policymakers now consider explicit caps on long-term rates, enforced through unlimited purchases. The logic is seductive. If rising yields cause instability, simply prevent them from rising. But this approach carries a hidden cost. When rates are capped while inflation remains elevated, the currency absorbs the adjustment. Savers lose purchasing power. Debt is repaid in weaker money. History offers clear examples. When governments choose to suppress yields rather than confront debt, inflation becomes the release valve. Wealth is transferred quietly, gradually, and relentlessly. It is not default by refusal. It is default by dilution. Those who save in nominal assets pay the price. In this environment, traditional investment assumptions fail. Bonds no longer hedge risk. Cash no longer preserves value. The line between monetary policy and fiscal survival blurs. Central banks cease to be neutral institutions and become active participants in funding the state. Independence becomes theoretical. This raises uncomfortable questions about the future. If long-term rates must remain controlled to preserve stability, how does the system absorb shocks? If inflation reaccelerates, who bears the cost? If confidence falters, can control be maintained without coercion? These are not abstract concerns. They shape real decisions being made today. There is also a global dimension. Other nations observe this experiment closely. Some emulate it. Others hedge against it by reducing exposure and accumulating assets beyond the reach of monetary manipulation. Gold purchases by central banks are not symbolic gestures. They are signals of mistrust in a system built on managed interest rates and expanding debt. For individuals, the implications are profound. The era of passive safety is gone. Risk has been redistributed, not eliminated. Understanding how interest rates are shaped is no longer optional. It determines wages, housing, retirement, and currency value. What appears as a technical adjustment on a balance sheet translates directly into everyday life. Operation Twist was never just a policy. It was a philosophy. The belief that markets could be guided, corrected, and overridden in pursuit of stability. In moments of crisis, that belief delivered results. But over time, it changed the nature of the system itself. What was once an emergency lever became a permanent fixture. The manipulation of long-term interest rates altered incentives, behavior, and expectations across the economy. It postponed pain, but it also magnified it. The longer distortion persists, the harder normalization becomes. The final cost is never eliminated. It is only deferred. As we stand now, the dance continues, slower and more strained than before. Each step requires greater force. Each intervention carries higher stakes. The question is no longer whether the yield curve will be shaped by policy. That is already true. The question is whether the system can survive once control becomes the only thing holding it together. As intervention becomes permanent rather than exceptional, the role of the central bank quietly transforms. What began as a lender of last resort becomes a manager of outcomes. Markets are no longer allowed to clear naturally if the results are politically or socially uncomfortable. Instead, prices are guided, volatility is suppressed, and time itself is smooth. This may appear stabilizing on the surface, but it carries a hidden cost. When uncertainty is artificially removed, fragility increases beneath the calm. One of the most dangerous byproducts of long-term rate suppression is moral hazard. When investors believe losses will be contained by policy response, risk-taking escalates, leverage increases, duration extends. The system becomes optimized not for resilience, but for policy protection. This is how small shocks turn into systemic threats. The margin for error disappears. Governments, to adapt their behavior, cheap long-term borrowing encourages programs that would be politically impossible under normal interest conditions. Debt matures quietly in the background, rolled over again and again at manageable rates. But this rolling depends entirely on continued control. The moment yields reflect reality, budgets strain, deficits explode, and promises unravel. The temptation to intervene again becomes irresistible. This is why yield manipulation tends to feed on itself. Each round creates conditions that require the next. Markets begin to anticipate intervention and price accordingly. The absence of intervention becomes the real shock. Stability becomes a function of expectation, not fundamentals. In that environment, credibility is everything. Once trust breaks, control becomes exponentially harder to maintain. A critical vulnerability emerges at the long end of the curve. Long-term bonds embed expectations about inflation, growth, and currency stability over decades. When those prices are managed rather than discovered, they stop communicating information. Policymakers lose their compass. Decisions are made in a fog of distorted signals, increasing the risk of policy error. The impact on savings culture has been profound. For generations, delayed consumption was rewarded. Interest income provided security and independence in retirement. With yields suppressed below inflation, saving becomes a losing strategy. Consumption is encouraged. Speculation is normalized. The social contract quietly shifts away from prudence toward risk dependence. This shift reshapes inequality. Those with access to assets benefit. Those reliant on wages and savings fall behind. Asset inflation widens the gap between owners and non-owners. While policy may lift averages, it polarizes outcomes. Stability at the macro level masks instability at the household level. As confidence in managed rates erodes, alternatives gain appeal. Hard assets, real assets, and decentralized stores of value attract attention not because they promise extraordinary returns, but because they lie outside the machinery of rate control. This is a rational response to a system where money itself is actively managed to solve debt problems. Internationally, the implications are just as serious. A currency backed by manipulated yields relies on trust rather than discipline. If foreign holders begin to doubt long-term value, demand shifts. Yield control then requires ever larger interventions. What starts as monetary policy edges into capital control by necessity. This is where technology enters the equation. Digital payment systems and programmable money expand the toolkit available to policymakers. In theory, they increase efficiency. In practice, they also reduce exit options. In a world where interest rates are capped and inflation is persistent, restricting capital mobility becomes the final line of defense. The danger is not a single dramatic collapse, but gradual normalization of control. Each step feels justified. Each measure is presented as temporary. Over time, the distinction between emergency and routine vanishes. Markets stop asking whether intervention is appropriate and instead ask only how large it will be. At this stage, the yield curve is no longer a reflection of collective expectations. It is a policy surface. Movements are interpreted not as signals, but as warnings of intervention to come. This feedback loop locks both policymakers and investors into a narrow corridor of outcomes. The irony is that the original purpose of manipulating long-term rates was stability. Yet long-term stability depends on adaptability. Systems that cannot tolerate volatility cannot adjust. They accumulate stress silently. When release finally comes, it is abrupt and destructive. History suggests that heavily managed systems rarely unwind gracefully. They either inflate away imbalances or experience sharp resets. Both paths impose costs. The difference lies in who pays and when. Suppressing yields delays the reckoning, but it does not eliminate it. Operation Twist, in all its modern variations, represents a choice. A choice to smooth today at the expense of tomorrow. A choice to prioritize borrowers over savers. A choice to substitute policy for price discovery. These choices can be defended in moments of crisis. The danger lies in making them permanent. As debt levels climb and demographic pressures mount, the incentive to maintain control grows stronger. The alternative, allowing rates to rise, naturally becomes politically unthinkable. This locks the system into a path where intervention is not an option, but an obligation. The result is a world where money no longer measures value, it enforces policy. Time is priced not by risk, but by necessity. The yield curve becomes less a market artifact and more a political instrument. Understanding this evolution is essential because it shapes the future of growth, savings, and currency credibility. The question is no longer whether long-term rates will be manipulated. The question is how long that manipulation can continue without breaking the trust it depends on. Operation Twist was once a clever adjustment. Today, it is a warning. A reminder that when markets are bent too far, they do not disappear. They wait. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video and want to stay updated with more insights on finance, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Financial Coin. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss our latest videos.